Welcome to the Hot News Channel, where we strip away the noise to analyze today's breaking stories. It is January 10th, 2026.
Today we have to address something that feels like a terrifying new level of geopolitical confrontation. The whole atmosphere is charged because the rules we all thought governed global conduct have been, they've been utterly discarded.
That is the pivotal moment we are dissecting today. The U.S. executive branch, having just successfully executed the most audacious foreign military capture in a generation.
The capture of President Maduro in Venezuela.
Exactly. And now they're operating with this sense of unilateral, unchecked power. It's rapidly escalating tensions globally. It's triggering direct military warnings from Russia. And it's also exporting that same doctrine of raw power right here to the streets of America.
We're witnessing the physical manifestation of a foreign policy that basically says we act when we want, where we want, and under no legal constraint. And the cost of that doctrine? Well, it's now measurable, not just in some abstract international conflict, but in the life of an American citizen, Renee Nicole Good, in Minneapolis.
The post-World War II rules-based international order is, for all intents and purposes, collapsing.
It is.
And it's being replaced by immediate, raw power politics. So our mission today is to take you through the source material, the expert analyses, and the hard data to really understand what this collapse means. Specifically, we have to ask, when this doctrine of foreign aggression comes home, what does that actually look like for you, the listener? Let's begin with the event that really acted as the accelerant for this entire geopolitical shift, the capture of Nicolas Maduro. This wasn't just a simple regime change operation. This was a military demonstration aimed at the entire world.
You really cannot overstate the psychological impact of this operation. To go into a foreign capital, target a sitting head of state on a military installation, and then just extract him. That's an act that's usually reserved only for declared wars.
Right.
The messaging here goes so far beyond Venezuela, it's aimed directly at Beijing, at Moscow, and at Tehran.
So let's unpack this with the specifics, because we've got some great sources on this. The assessment from Robert O'Neill, the former Navy SEAL who killed Osama bin Laden, it gives us an almost unbelievable picture of the scale.
It does.
He described this as a lightning-fast, 2-hour snatch-and-grab operation conducted by Delta Force.
And O'Neill's figures, they're just stunning. This was not some small special ops team slipping in unnoticed. Right. He confirmed the involvement of 150 aircraft.
150.
150. You're talking about helicopters, fixed-wing transports, surveillance, the whole package, and a deployment of between 200 and 250 troops. That's a tactical commitment that signals extreme national resolve, no matter what they call the operation publicly.
And the execution itself was, from a military standpoint, it was flawless. They hate what O'Neill called the Venezuelan Pentagon. They extracted Maduro and his wife, Cilia Flores, and had them completely out of Venezuelan airspace within 24 hours.
Mm-hmm.
But the detail that really blew me away, and this is so crucial for the messaging, was O'Neill's confirmation of 0 casualties reported on the U.S. side.
0 casualties.
Despite attacking an active army base.
That 0 casualty figure is the signature on the military message. In O'Neill's own words, it was a successful go-fuck-yourself demonstration of U.S. capability.
Yeah.
It was designed to show that if Washington decides it wants a leader, it doesn't matter if that leader is protected by Chinese assets or Russian intelligence.
Right.
The U.S. will take them with surgical precision and without penalty.
Right.
But the effectiveness of the military action, well, it only throws the political and legal justifications into this stark, almost embarrassing relief.
Okay, so let's pivot immediately to that, to the legal facade, because this is where the absurdity truly begins. When Maduro was arrested, the administration didn't declare war. They didn't cite some political necessity. They framed it as the capture of a fugitive from justice. The charges brought against a sitting head of state captured on his own military base, felony possession of machine guns.
The charges just don't pass the basic common sense check. The man is the commander-in-chief of a nation's military. He's operating within his military headquarters,
yes,
and he's charged with a weapons violation. Professor Jeffrey Sachs correctly pointed out that this fails the smirk test immediately.
It does.
But the legal underpinning for the military action itself is even more concerning. The whole operation was conducted under the 2001 Authorization for the Use of Military Force. the AUMF.
The AUMF. For our listeners who might not track every piece of post-9/11 legislation, that was passed to authorize military force against those responsible for the September 11th attacks, al-Qaeda and associated forces. So why are legal experts calling the use of the AUMF for a Venezuelan coup bonkers?
Well, because the AUMF has already been stretched beyond all recognition to cover everything from Afghanistan to ISIS operations in Syria. But to use it against the state of Venezuela, claiming Maduro is somehow an associated force of 9/11, it's a constitutional joke.
It's a huge stretch.
Legal experts argue this just proves the administration is searching for the most pliable, least scrutinized legal hook available, precisely because the operation violates international norms, the UN Charter, and the War Powers Act. It's essentially weaponizing a decades-old, open-ended authorization to justify any military action the executive desires.
And the whole narrative surrounding his alleged criminal activities, the very basis for claiming he was a fugitive in the first place, that also seems to have fallen apart under the slightest pressure.
That's where the reporting from journalists like Max Blumenthal becomes absolutely essential. The previous administration had charged Maduro with leading the Cartel de los Soles, the Cartel of the Suns.
Right.
What's fascinating is that the Department of Justice immediately dropped that claim right after the capture.
So why? Why drop the main charge?
Because, as Blumenthal's sources confirmed, the Cartel de los Soles was not an actual organized crime syndicate in the sense of, the Sinaloa or Medellin cartels.
So it was essentially a manufactured narrative.
Exactly. The term Cartel de los Soles, it originated as Venezuelan military slang. It was just referring to drug corruption within the upper ranks, specifically officers who wore these little sun insignias on their uniforms.
I see.
The CIA, in preparing the initial indictment, basically took this street slang for internal corruption and fabricated it into a formal, structured, transnational criminal organization, all to justify the fugitive status in the indictment. When the operation actually succeeded, the DOJ had to admit that the formal organized crime charge was, it was unsustainable in court.
So without that key charge, the entire legal case now hinges on a single, very compromised individual.
It rests heavily on the testimony of Hugo Carvajal, who was the former head of Venezuelan military counterintelligence. He was extradited and reportedly made a very, very favorable plea deal. But what our sources highlight is that even U.S. intelligence assessments had previously suggested that Maduro himself did not control this alleged gang. He just, tolerated the corruption or was surrounded by it. So relying solely on a coerced star witness who has cut a deal makes the entire proceeding look less like justice and more like a political show trial, designed purely to legitimize the extraction.
The legal gymnastics, though, they become kind of secondary when you consider the president's own public statements about the real motive. He didn't even pretend this was about machine guns or fugitives for long.
No, the veneer of justice lasted about 12 hours before the president just tore it away to reveal the core motive: oil, resources, and fundamentally control.
The fact finder has to relay Trump's direct declaration right after the operation. He stated the U.S. will be running the oil and that he was meeting with the top 14 oil executives to rebuild the infrastructure. He made sure to explicitly remind everyone that Venezuela has the biggest proven oil reserves on Earth. The public rhetoric is promising this immediate economic gain.
And this is where we have to introduce the economic reality check, which is so essential for understanding the true strategic calculus here. The idea of quick, easy profits from Venezuelan oil is a fantasy, according to analysts like Pepe Escobar.
Right.
We are talking about infrastructure that has been decaying for years because of sanctions, a lack of foreign capital, and just plain mismanagement.
So what are the specific technical hurdles? I mean, what's involved in reconditioning an industry of that size?
It's a vast, incredibly complex ecosystem. You've got extraction, refining, transportation. Escobar noted that it would take, at best, 5 years just to recondition the industry's existing infrastructure for American technical standards and needs.
5 years just to get started.
Just to get it back up to speed. We're talking about massive specialized equipment, everything from compressors and drill bits to these highly corrosive oil pipelines that need complete replacement or refurbishment. And the cost estimate, even for moderate production, to reach a mere 3 million barrels a day, which is still way below Venezuela's peak output, it requires a staggering $183 billion of investment over 16 years.
$183 billion. That is a colossal long-term commitment that American oil CEOs, who are completely focused on quarterly returns, must view with extreme skepticism.
They have to.
So if the motive isn't quick, easy profit, what is the strategic gain? This moves us squarely into the geopolitical reality of this rising tripolar world dynamic.
It is fundamentally a strategy of China containment and leverage. China is heavily reliant on Venezuela. They receive between 8 and 13% of their oil from that country, and historically, 80% of Venezuela's total oil sales have gone straight to Beijing.
Wow.
And often as repayment for these massive debt-for-oil deals.
So this means the Venezuela action is a direct economic and strategic assault on China's resource security in the Western Hemisphere.
Absolutely. Analysts like Greg Grandin view the Venezuela action as a bellicose and unmistakable effort to sabotage China's investment plans, which include ownership stakes in specific oil fields and infrastructure projects, and to restrict their access to critical resources.
Right.
The U.S. is signaling that its backyard is closed.
Right.
And it is willing to use military force, regardless of the cost, to expel a major geopolitical rival's influence. It's an assertion of a modernized, very aggressive Donroe Doctrine.
Now, this action, despite being framed as a major foreign policy victory for the administration, it immediately generated significant political blowback at home, particularly from within the Republican Party, which indicates a real internal conflict between the executive's desires and political reality.
The internal tension is palpable. Reuters reported that Republican lawmakers were just inundating the White House with furious calls. They are genuinely worried about the 2026 midterms, and they see this Venezuelan adventure as a huge electoral liability.
So they're seeing the polling data.
Exactly. The reports state that lawmakers were aggressively complaining to the White House chief of staff for focusing entirely on running Venezuela when their internal polls consistently show that 70 to 80% of Americans oppose this kind of foreign intervention.
70 to 80%.
They want the focus on domestic issues like affordability, healthcare, and infrastructure.
So the political class is focused on survival, while the executive seems completely consumed by the psychological demonstration of unilateral power.
And that is the essential point. What the Venezuelan action confirms is that the domestic political cost is secondary to the psychological demonstration of power to global rivals. It sets this precedent that the U.S. executive branch can and will act wherever it wants, ignoring international law, circumventing congressional oversight, and even endangering its own party's electoral chances. This unilateralism is the perfect bridge to our next segment.
The Venezuela operation, as audacious as it was not an isolated event. It was the proof of concept for a much broader global shift in American foreign policy, a new, aggressive interpretation of the Donroe Doctrine.
This is where we really have to lean on Greg Grandin's analysis, because it provides the crucial conceptual framework. He noted that the Trump administration's strategy is the rehabilitation and globalization of the pre-modern Donroe Doctrine.
The original doctrine, of course, was designed to keep European powers out of the Western Hemisphere.
Right. But now it's being used as a complete substitute for liberal international law.
So instead of respecting things like the UN Charter or international treaties, the U.S. is reverting to what Grandin called Heritage America, a view that raw power and interest, not law, govern relations between nations.
That's it, exactly. Right. The doctrine is no longer just a regional prohibition. It's been interpreted as a universal police warrant. That allows the U.S. to protect its interests wherever it wants, whenever it wants. So if the U.S. perceives a threat to its resource security or its military dominance anywhere on the globe, it grants itself the authority to intervene.
And the prime, most alarming example of this globalized thinking right now is the escalating threat that's being directed toward Greenland.
Yes, this takes the concept of unilateral action way beyond the hemisphere and right into the very heart of the NATO alliance.
It forces a direct confrontation with a NATO ally, Denmark, over a strategically vital piece of Arctic territory.
Unbelievable.
Let's just review the stunning statements from the executive branch on this issue. The president, fresh off the success in Caracas, declared, quote, "We're going to do something with Greenland, either the nice way or the more difficult way." And then he laid down the hard line. We're not going to have Russia or China occupy Greenland.
And that threat was immediately amplified by Deputy Chief of Staff Stephen Miller, who flat out refused to take military force off the table regarding Greenland. His logic, which is rooted in this pure, cynical power politics, was that, quote, nobody is going to fight the United States over Greenland.
So he's basically saying we can do what we want.
He is. This is the administration telling Denmark, a sovereign nation and a long-standing NATO member, that the U.S. assesses their military will to be non-existent. If we want it, we will take it.
This stance raises a profound and truly terrifying geopolitical dilemma for Europe and specifically for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Denmark oversees Greenland's defense, and they claim the decision is solely Greenland's. But what happens if the U.S. actually attempts to force a military occupation or a seizure?
This is the theoretical scenario that has to be keeping NATO leadership awake at night. If the U.S. were to invade Greenland, a territory of Denmark, Denmark could theoretically invoke Article 5 of the NATO treaty.
And for our listeners, Article 5 is the absolute cornerstone of the alliance. An attack on one member is considered an attack on all.
Right.
So we have the unprecedented situation where one NATO member, the United States, could provoke an invocation of Article 5 by another member.
Precisely. The question for every other NATO capital, London, Paris, Berlin, becomes existential. Do they honor the treaty and treat the U.S. invasion of Greenland as an attack on themselves? The political consequences would be just disastrous. It would fundamentally fracture the alliance, render it meaningless, or, in the worst-case scenario, it could lead to an armed confrontation between allies.
Senator Mark Warner voiced this exact anxiety. He was wondering aloud if it would, quote, really require a War Powers Act to stop Trump from attacking a NATO ally in the case of Denmark and Greenland. The fact that this is even a discussion point shows how far the notion of shared institutional restraint has just eroded.
And, just like with Venezuela, the motivation here ties directly back to resource control and China containment. Former Commodore Steve Jeremy pointed out that China is already Greenland's #1 trading partner.
Already #1.
They're primarily accessing strategic mineral wealth and new trade routes. So the U.S. threat isn't just about establishing a military base. It's about restricting China's growing economic interests in the Arctic. They see Greenland as yet another crucial node in this tripolar competition for global resources.
So we see the executive applying this universal police warrant concept everywhere, in the Western Pacific, in the Caribbean, and now in the Arctic. It's a demand that the U.S. asserts spheres of influence everywhere, while demanding that no rival power is allowed to exercise similar influence, economic or military, in what the U.S. deems its historical or strategic orbit.
It is, in essence, an inconsistent, hyper-aggressive, and incredibly destabilizing application of pure power that just invites a proportional response. And that brings us directly to Moscow's reaction.
The escalating aggression in Venezuela and the threats against Greenland have triggered a proportional strategic response from Russia. Unilateral action doesn't happen in a vacuum. It generates a reaction designed to raise the cost of intervention. This brings us to the terrifying deployment of the Oreshnik missile system.
The Oreshnik missile deployment is Russia's clear, high-stakes signal to the West that there's a red line the U.S. cannot cross without immediate, devastating consequence. The action followed on the heels of Russia hitting U.S.-owned facilities inside Ukraine just days earlier.
And the location was key.
The location of the Oreshnik strike, Lviv, which, as analyst Larry Johnson noted, is very near the NATO border, was entirely deliberate. It's designed to maximize the psychological impact on Europe.
So let's get into the hard data on this weapon. We're relying on the essential analysis provided by MIT professor Ted Postol. What exactly makes the Oreshnik a game-changer in this geopolitical standoff?
Postol described the Oreshnik as a one-stage intermediate-range ballistic missile, or IRBM. It's likely derived from the established RS-26 or RS-27 systems. But the most critical factor here is speed. We are talking about hypersonic velocity.
How fast are we talking?
This missile travels over Mach 11 at its highest point in flight, its apogee, and it only slows slightly to an impact speed of around Mach 10.
Mach 10, that's 10 times the speed of sound. Strategically, why is that speed so significant in the context of NATO defense systems?
Because Mach 10 means it is incredibly difficult, if not completely impossible, for current NATO ballistic missile defense systems to intercept it reliably. Systems like TAID or the Patriot are designed to track and intercept much slower, lower trajectory missiles. A target moving at Mach 10 or greater just significantly reduces the reaction time for defensive sensors and interceptors. It effectively guarantees the payload reaches its target. The Oreshnik is designed to penetrate defenses, not evade them.
Okay, now let's talk about the destructive potential of the conventional payload that was used in this strike.
The conventional payload is released from 6 separate tiered canisters. Each individual munition delivers about 150 pounds of explosive yield, which is comparable to standard high-explosive TNT. The key innovation, though, is the total payload spread. Postol estimates the entire payload delivers between 6,000 and 10,000 pounds of TNT spread over a cluster area that's roughly 800 meters to 1 kilometer long.
So it's an area saturation weapon.
Exactly. It's designed to saturate a vast area. guaranteeing the destruction of a significant military installation, a command center, or a major industrial target.
But Postol's most chilling analysis was about the missile's capability beyond its conventional use, its potential nuclear subtext.
And this is the true strategic horror show. Postol stressed that this missile could easily be configured to carry 5 or 6 half-megaton nuclear warheads. If configured that way, those warheads would cause mass fires over a staggeringly wide area, somewhere between 150 and 200 square kilometers.
Unbelievable.
The deployment of the Oreshnik, even if it was conventionally armed in this instance near Lviv, it underscores Russia's strategic ability to completely devastate any European capital or major U.S. military base without relying on their full strategic nuclear arsenal. It is a statement of overwhelming regional capability and a direct response to the U.S.'s display of power in Caracas.
The Oreshnik deployment is one half of Russia's mirroring strategy. The other half is direct economic and logistical confrontation on the high seas, which some are starting to call state-sponsored piracy.
Yes, Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson detailed this escalation. In direct retaliation for U.S. actions, Russia had seized 12 U.S. cargo ships. These are ships carrying American cargo with full or partially American crews in key strategic waterways: the Arctic, the Black Sea, and the Baltic approaches. This is a direct, calculated retaliation designed to inflict immediate economic pain and disrupt logistics.
This action, it sounds like something out of the 17th century, but it's framed by Wilkerson and Larry Johnson as strategic mirroring. Russia is essentially holding a mirror up to U.S. actions over the last several years.
Johnson notes that Russia sees this as direct retaliation for the U.S. enforcing sanctions by using its military vessels to shoulder and board Russian ships in contested areas like the Baltic and Black Sea. The U.S. has been unilaterally asserting the right to interfere with Russian commerce under the banner of international law enforcement and sanctions.
So the roles have flipped.
The roles have completely flipped. Russia is employing the exact same tactics, leading Johnson to observe that the U.S. is now being accused, quite accurately in this context, of acting like the Somali pirates.
So if the U.S. claims they're enforcing international sanctions and Russia claims they are enforcing their own retaliatory rules, how do we distinguish on the global stage between piracy and enforcement?
That is the crucial question, isn't it? When the rules-based order dissolves, the distinction disappears. It just becomes a war of rules, where each power uses military force to enforce its own unilaterally declared laws upon the other. It's anarchy on the high seas.
The cumulative effect of the Venezuela operation, the Greenland threats, and these direct military and piracy escalations is that diplomacy is now utterly broken.
Professor John Mearsheimer stated flatly that this aggressive posture, and this includes previously reported CIA involvement in the drone attack on President Putin's residence, is another case of the U.S. crossing deep red lines. Mearsheimer concludes that diplomacy with the current Trump administration is now, quote, off the table.
Off the table.
Russia has determined that the outcome will be settled through demonstrated power and capability, not through negotiated settlements with what Professor Jeffrey Sachs derisively called the 2 real estate agents that Trump sends to negotiate. The stage is now set for continuous escalating confrontations.
The unilateral aggression displayed by the U.S. has a destabilizing effect that goes far beyond Russia. Let's turn our attention now to Iran, which is currently facing its most severe wave of protests since 2022, compounding all these geopolitical tensions.
The primary, undeniable root of this instability is economic. Iran's currency is collapsing due to 43 years of comprehensive sanctions. Pepe Escar detailed the devastating long-term impact of this economic strangulation. This stress, the inability to afford food, medicine, and basic goods, is the overwhelming driver for the widespread discontent. It makes these protests far more serious and regime-threatening than previous movements that were driven primarily by social issues.
And we have some hard data that reflects the level of violence and escalation on the ground, suggesting that external actors may be exploiting these genuine, economically driven protests.
Yes, reports are citing over 200 people dead in Tehran alone. Furthermore, sources indicate that external actors, referred to generally as MSAD, which is a reference to foreign intelligence or state-sponsored groups operating externally, are actively escalating the violence.
How so?
This includes specific, aggressive acts like attacking mosques, which are usually sanctuaries, and setting 48 fire trucks on fire.
And crucially, these actors appear to be coordinating the narrative as well.
Yes. There are reports of these external groups providing specific scripts and phrases to protesters to shout on video. That suggests a coordinated foreign influence pushing the legitimate economic protests into violent, regime change-oriented action designed for maximum media impact in the West.
The U.S. policy towards these protests is deeply contradictory, which reflects the administration's chaotic, power-first approach to foreign policy.
It's a policy that pretty much guarantees more civilian deaths, regardless of the outcome. President Trump threatened to launch airstrikes on Iran if the Iranian government kills protesters. As analysts quickly pointed out, that move would simply kill more Iranian civilians and completely shatter any pretense of protecting human rights.
Right.
It is military coercion disguised poorly as humanitarian concern, and it's following the successful formula that was used in Venezuela.
So how is the Iranian government responding to this combined internal economic pressure and the external military threat?
The response has been fiercely nationalistic and defiant. We are seeing extremely strong words, even from Iran's foreign minister, who is usually considered the most diplomatic voice in the room. He stated chillingly, "We'd rather die than bow to the West and die an honorable death than live on our knees." These statements signal a hardened, unified stance against external pressure and the threat of regime change, meaning that if conflict comes, it will be met with maximum resistance.
This entire situation is just fraught with historical warning signs regarding U.S. attempts at regime change, which should caution any administration, yet they seem to be entirely ignored here.
Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis stresses that U.S. regime change efforts historically backfire dramatically, leading to decades of instability and regional chaos. Look at the data. Libya, where regime change resulted in a civil war and competing governments that are still unsettled since 2011.
Or Iraq.
Where the power vacuum led directly to years of civil war and gave rise to ISIS and other militant groups.
Yet, the administration seems completely immune to these historical facts, especially after the military success in Venezuela.
Exactly. When asked why the Venezuelan operation would go well despite the historical record, Trump reportedly waved off the failures, claiming, quote, "I have only had success militarily, politically, everything I've done has only worked." This perceived invincibility, especially after Caracas, is the real long-term danger.
And the geopolitical ramifications of this instability put immense pressure on the competing alliance structure.
The capture of Maduro and the engineered instability in Iran send a clear message to Moscow and Beijing. The U.S. will go after your key proxies and allies. This makes the Russian-Chinese alliance seem less reliable as protectors. This pressure could actually accelerate the geopolitical shift towards a tripolar world where the U.S. challenges the alliance everywhere, from the Western Hemisphere to the Middle East, potentially hardening that bloc into an even more aggressive, unified front simply for survival.
We have discussed the doctrine of unilateral, unchecked power demonstrated in Venezuela, in the threats against Greenland, and in the confrontation with Russia and Iran. We now come to the final and most crucial segment of our deep dive, drawing the direct line between that executive arrogance abroad and the manifest actions of federal agents domestically. This is about the tragic, unjustified death of Renee Nicole Good in South Minneapolis.
This is the cost of the universal police warrant coming home. What stands out here is the speed and the coordination of the administration's response, which was an immediate, aggressive smear campaign against the victim. This is the government attempting to pre-justify the use of lethal force. DHS immediately claimed she weaponized her vehicle.
And the president himself participated actively in this narrative framing.
Yes, President Trump publicly called her very disorderly and asserted that she had, quote, violently and viciously run over the ICE officer, implying the agent was justified in using deadly force. This established the official narrative for the press and the public. The officer was the victim of a violent assault.
But the available footage and eyewitness accounts absolutely contradict this official narrative.
This is so critical. The footage that has emerged shows a dramatically different scenario. It shows her vehicle moving very slowly, not violently accelerating or assaulting the officer. Furthermore, she appears to be waving other cars past her stopped vehicle, indicating confusion or maybe a panicked attempt to leave the area, as is often the case in vehicle stops.
Right.
Experts in use of force protocols immediately highlighted that fleeing a vehicle stop, especially at low speed, is not justification for deadly force. Officers are trained to move out of the way to de-escalate rather than create a tactical exigency by firing shots.
It paints a picture of federal agents using maximum disproportionate force against an unarmed citizen who was attempting to disengage, which was then immediately covered up by the executive branch.
And this incident is not isolated. It's part of a disturbing, escalating pattern of federal agent violence under this administration. The data is stark. Since last January, 14 people have been shot by federal agents, resulting in 4 fatalities, often involving situations where the target was attempting to drive away, much like Mrs. Good.
And who is responsible for ensuring impartiality and justice in these cases?
That's the accountability crisis. The investigation into the shooting is being overseen by the FBI, which is directly under the current administration. This leads to serious questions about impartiality and the integrity of the justice process, according to oversight groups like The Intercept. When the institutions responsible for checking executive power are themselves controlled by that same executive, accountability vanishes.
This institutional failure and the unchecked use of deadly force domestically circle right back to the core philosophical dilemma that underpins this entire deep dive: the administration's self-justification for acting without constraint.
The ultimate philosophical underpinning for this behavior, both foreign and domestic, was revealed in a truly startling comment the president made publicly. "I listen to my own morality."
That statement is the linchpin of the crisis. It explicitly replaces institutional, constitutional, and even religious morality with the personal, arbitrary will of the executive.
And this creates a direct conflict, a morality crisis, within the administration and its base. It directly clashes with the rhetoric of prominent religious figures like Franklin Graham and others in the administration, who claim their support is guided by objective biblical principles and who assert the president is godly. When the president publicly declares, "I listen to my own morality," he is saying that external checks, whether they are treaties, constitutional constraints, or established religious or ethical codes, are secondary, if not completely irrelevant.
The long-term danger, as analysts like Glenn Greenwald point out, is that unchecked power, when divorced from any objective law or external morality, becomes purely nihilistic. The conceptual bridge between Caracas and Minneapolis is this: if the executive can unilaterally ignore sovereignty and international law to seize a president in Venezuela, it can and will ignore institutional law and due process to smear and kill an unarmed citizen in Minneapolis.
The success of the unilateral power play abroad, that zero-casualty extraction of Maduro, it emboldens agencies like DHS and ICE to operate with zero accountability domestically. The executive branch has positioned itself as the ultimate decider on who's a fugitive, what constitutes an attack, and what morality applies, both to foreign leaders and to its own citizens.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? The single most important concept to remember this week is that the Venezuela operation was less a rational diplomatic or economic calculation and far more a declaration of unilateral power. It set the precedent that the executive will operate solely based on its own immediate perceived interests.
When a president views himself as the ultimate decider, replacing institutional checks with personal will, the Donroe Doctrine of morality, if you will, crossing red lines abroad becomes normalized. And the consequences, from major geopolitical escalation like Russia's deployment of the Oreshnik missile system to deadly domestic incidents like the killing of Renee Good by a federal agent, will inevitably follow. The centralization of power and the abandonment of norms have created a deeply precarious global and domestic reality.
The question now is not if the empire can sustain this level of unchecked aggression, but how high the price will be for those who live under this rule of personal, arbitrary power.
The provocative thought we want to leave you with this week is this: if the Trump administration's foreign policy goal is fundamentally to sabotage Chinese influence globally, and yet its aggression against countries like Venezuela and Iran pushes Beijing even closer to Moscow for resource and security guarantees, has the entire unilateral strategy become strategically self-defeating and counterproductive to its own stated goals?
If you found this analysis valuable, hit the plus or follow button on your podcast app and give us a like. Subscribe to the Hot News channel for more deep dives. Until we meet again. Goodbye.